Today, we are going to explore the most brutal revenge killings ever recorded. From calculated acts of vengeance that consumed entire families to cold-blooded retribution that shocked even hardened investigators. It was October 2nd, 2016, in Imperial County, California. A large square net hung 200 feet above a dry lake bed from 4 mobile cranes. A small jump plane circled overhead while the ground crew watched wind flags. Tyler Nash was a 29-year-old rigging technician from San Diego with over 800 jumps. He wanted to attempt a net-only jump with no parachute, falling directly into the catching system below. Nash had trained for months and practiced with smoke canisters to judge wind drift. He worked on small body movements like shoulder rolls, foot, and head angle. He trusted his ability to judge depth and distance, and relied on the way the desert horizon stayed steady when his flight path was correct. The setup on the lake bed was simple and easy to spot from the air. A 100 by 100 foot net was suspended about 200 feet above the ground from 4 mobile cranes, with a bright X marking the center. Below it, the impact zone was cleared of vehicles and equipment, and a medical unit staged nearby. The county had issued permits for the demonstration. The FAA was notified, and the sheriff's office posted a unit on the access road. At dawn, the flags barely moved. By mid-morning, the wind had increased to around 10 to 12 miles per hour and came a few degrees off the predicted direction. The flight path Nash planned assumed light wind from behind, but the crosswind grew stronger, pushing the flight line to the south. Nash rode up in the jump plane with a spotter and a cameraman. He wore an oxygen mask for the climb and a GPS logger. On the ground, spotters used wind flags and a handheld anemometer. The plan called for a stable belly-down fall to build speed, then a roll to head down in the last few thousand feet to adjust the line. While he was still in the plane, radio traffic stayed calm as the crew chief called out wind readings and suggested a wave off and reset if the crosswind drift looked wrong. Nash pulled off the mask seconds before exit. Nash exited the plane cleanly and held a steady position. As he fell, the crosswind pulled his flight path a few feet off center. He rolled slightly to correct his position, then rolled back. Spotters tracked his position against the center mark for the log. The net filled more of the camera frame as he got closer. In the final seconds, he came in high and moving fast. A spotter standing at the base of a mobile crane said Nash was slightly off target before he disappeared from view. He hit the edge of the net webbing, bounced outside the square, and fell through the gap beyond the frame. The impact zone team ran toward him. The pilot climbed and held clear as briefed. The scene remained controlled as emergency responders reached Nash. The sheriff's unit secured the area while medical personnel worked. The crew secured and then lowered the net for safety and documentation and began packing equipment. Deputies took statements from the pilot, the crew chief, and the 2 closest observers, including the spotter who had called out the drift measurements. Later, the GPS data showed his path veered a few degrees in the last 1,000 feet, matching what the wind flags indicated. Nash's funeral was held a week later at a small church in San Diego. Friends from the jumping community brought his helmet and logbook to the service. County officials reviewed the setup with an independent engineer. The engineer found the rig met its stated load specs, but left little margin if a jumper arrived off-center. The FAA and the sheriff's office listed the death as accidental, with wind drift as a contributing factor. The county coroner ruled the cause of death blunt force trauma. In the local jumping community, the incident served as a warning that being slightly off target can be dangerous when the landing area is small and wind conditions change. It was July the 22nd, 2017, in Yosemite National Park, California. A narrow ribbon of webbing stretched between 2 rock points near Taft Point. The drop below was more than 2,000 feet to the valley floor. Evan Cole was 28 years old and worked at a gear shop in Reno. He spent weekends on slacklines and highlines. Cole was known for careful knots, neat anchors, and long practice sessions. More on clean technique than social media attention. He kept records of each session in a spiral notebook. That morning, he wanted to make a clean walk across the line without safety ropes for the camera. At sunrise, a small crew set up a 1-inch line about 120 feet long across a gap near the overlook. under park guidelines with required permits. They built 2 separate anchor systems using slings, bolts, and backup webbing, with edge protection at contact points. Tag lines kept the slack organized during setup. Most walkers attached a safety leash. Cole chose to go without one. Tourists began arriving as the sun came over the ridge. A park map sign moved slightly in a breeze that came and went. A handheld wind meter at the setup showed 6 to 10 miles per hour with occasional stronger gusts. The crew checked tension, checked knots, and checked the edge protection and leash snag checks at the anchors in case someone with a leash fell back into the rock. Cole walked back and forth at the start anchor in bare feet, wiping dust off his feet. He stood up, shook out his arms, and stepped onto the webbing. The line moved under him as lines normally do, with small waves from his weight and small waves from the air. He bent his knees and took slow steps, looking at the far anchor. The breeze pushed from his right side. He paused, let the motion settle, and kept moving. People watching held their breath without meaning to. A visitor with a camera later said it was quiet, except for wind and the small sound of the webbing. Halfway across, a stronger gust hit from the same direction. The line dipped and rolled a few inches. Cole lowered into a crouch to absorb the motion. He stood up again, took a step, and the line rolled a little more. A person watching from the overlook said Cole wobbled once, then twice, and the line moved out from under his foot. Cole tried to sit down on the line, but missed catching it and fell into open space. Without a safety leash, there was nothing to stop the fall. The crew at each anchor could only watch him fall past the cliff into open air. Park rangers were already in the area and called for more support. The overlook was cleared while a rescue team set up below. A helicopter was requested but canceled as ground teams moved into position. The response changed from rescue to recovery. Rangers took statements from the people who set up the line, nearby hikers, and the 2 closest tourists at the railing. The crew gave rangers the handheld wind readings and photos of the anchors before taking down the equipment. A ranger measured anchor positions, line length, and webbing type. The site was marked and photographed. By late afternoon, recovery teams reached the location below the cliff. The coroner documented the scene, and the body was transported out by ground crews. The park reopened the overlook with a ranger posted to answer questions and prevent copycat attempts. A week later, family and friends held a short memorial at the trailhead. They read from Cole's training notebook and placed webbing and a flower near the start point. A small service was held in Reno 2 days later. The National Park Service reviewed the event as an accidental fall. Rangers updated visitor information to stress the risks of walking high lines without safety ropes. The county coroner listed the cause of death as blunt force trauma. Among local slackliners, the incident became a rule. Wind plus height increases risk without a safety leash. Crews added one more check to their routine. If wind stayed above single digits, they attached safety lines or packed up. It was September 10, 2015, in the Lauterbrunnen Valley, Switzerland. Clouds sat high over steep walls that dropped more than 2,000 feet to the meadows and a narrow road below. Daniel Price was 31 years old and worked as a software tester. He was taking time off from work. All summer, he had been flying clean lines in the mountains and keeping notes on wind, cloud base, and landmarks. He preferred steady plans over last-second choices and skipped exits that looked busy or gusty. He wanted one clean valley run before flying home. 2 friends hiked with him to the jumping spot just after sunrise. The air felt cool, and the wind at ground level moved the grass lightly. From the spot, they could see a big piece of rock that stuck out, then a line of trees on a slope. The plan was simple: fly left of the rock, go over the trees, and clear the road with plenty of room. They laid out the wingsuit and checked zippers, booties, and grippers. A small helmet-mounted camera recorded the exit and flight, and a small GPS logger sat under the suit. One friend stayed at the exit with a camera on his head. The other drove down and set a tripod at a pullout along the road to film from below. Cell coverage worked at the valley floor, so they kept a phone open for basic updates. Wind looked light. Leaves moved, but there were no strong gusts or swirling air in the nearby trees. The clouds stayed high and steady. Price practiced the path with his hands. A smooth push, quick speed up, then a slight left to miss the big rock and a gentle right to go over the trees. He clipped his visual altimeter to his wrist, set an audible in his helmet, and stepped to a known exit notch used by locals. Price pushed off cleanly and reached flight in seconds. From the camera at the ledge, his suit gained speed, and the valley opened under his path. He angled left toward the shoulder of rock. The line looked accurate and tight. As he crossed the big rock, the suit flew close to the wall. A small fix came late, and the path stayed near the stone longer than planned. From the field below, a farmer looked up at the sound of wind moving over fabric. The roadside camera showed a brief hit with rock, a change in direction, and then a crash out of view. His friend at the ledge called the friend at the road, who called emergency services. A rescue helicopter was requested. Mountain Rescue reached the slope first and coordinated with the helicopter crew. The site lay below the trees and above the road on a steep mix of dirt and loose rock. Teams set a safety perimeter and asked drivers to keep moving so the road wouldn't back up with onlookers. Police took statements from the two friends, the farmer, and two drivers who had pulled into the same roadside turnout as the tripod. The friend at the road handed over the tripod footage and the timestamps. The friend at the exit provided the helmet video and a copy of the GPS file. Weather notes from that morning were written in a pocket notebook and matched the light wind that locals reported. By early afternoon, rescue teams finished the recovery and moved equipment back to the road. The helicopter was sent away. Police marked the jumping spot, the flight path along the wall, and the area above the trees where the path changed. They measured distances so the pictures could be matched to the records later. The next week, Price's parents held a small cremation in their hometown. Co-workers joined by video and sent a simple wreath. His friends shared the last GPS track and said he had kept to the plan until the left-hand section near the buttress. Cantonal Police and Mountain Rescue documented the GPS, the weather notes, and both videos. Authorities reminded visitors that small errors at high speed leave no margin in tight terrain and asked wingsuit flyers to choose conservative lines when winds are not steady. The coroner listed blunt force trauma as the cause of death. Among flyers who used the valley, the run became a quiet example used in safety talks. Keep more room near rock, keep decisions simple, and if a line asks for perfect timing, treat it as a warning, not a goal. It was May 8, 2018, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Early morning light was low over a row of flat roofs, and morning moisture made the black tar wet and shiny. Marcus Hale was 23 years old and went to community college. He made roof running videos for a small channel. He worked nights at a cafe and trained on weekends. He practiced gap jumps in gyms first, using tape marks to measure takeoff and landing. He told friends this would be the last big one before finals week. At first light, Marcus and two friends went upstairs inside the building and pushed through a metal door. The roof was standard built-up tar and gravel with a low parapet about 18 inches high. Across the alley, the second roof sat about 4 feet lower with an 18-inch parapet. They measured the gap with a tape, roughly 11 feet across with a drop of about 4 feet to the landing surface. On camera, the space looked longer than it did in person. They set a phone on a small tripod and did walkthroughs. Rubber soles left light marks on damp tar. The run-up gave Marcus about 30 feet to build speed, plant, and lift. He scuffed his shoes on a rough patch for grip and wiped the takeoff spot with a towel, but the tar remained slick. Sirens sounded a few blocks away, and the group started rushing. One friend called out the count and held the frame. Marcus took 3 practice runs to mark his steps. On the 4th try, he ran harder, head level, arms set for swing. His plant foot hit the damp edge. The shoe slid a few inches, and the takeoff turned into a low, flat jump. He reached for the opposite wall, hit the edge with both hands, and could not hold on. His body swung and fell back into the gap. The two friends ran to the edge and looked down into the narrow space between buildings. One called 911 and gave the cross streets. The other went back through the door to reach the alley from the ground level. Police and fire units arrived soon after the call. An EMS crew took over and moved carefully in the tight space. Officers taped off the alley, set a safety perimeter, and kept people away. The phone and tripod were collected, and the friends gave their names. A supervisor asked the building manager to lock the roof door. Detectives spoke with a neighbor who heard the slide and with 2 workers who had been unloading a van nearby. The friends explained the plan and showed earlier gym videos on a second phone. They pointed out the wet tar and the towel at the takeoff spot. One detective walked out the run-up and the gap, wrote down the numbers, and took photos of both walls. By mid-morning, investigators finished their scene work. The coroner later listed blunt force trauma as the cause of death. Officers cleared the alley and returned the block to regular traffic. Building management replaced the temporary door latch with a lock and posted a notice warning against unauthorized access. The funeral took place that weekend at a neighborhood church, and the seats were full. His coach from the gym spoke for a few minutes about caution and skill. Police treated the case as a trespass-related accident with no sign of foul play. Building owners added locked doors and new warning signs, and the property manager sent a memo to tenants about roof access and safety. In the small parkour community nearby, the video turned into a training note rather than a clip to share. Coaches repeated 3 points in classes the next week. Do a dry run on dry ground. Do not rush a takeoff when the surface is wet. And measure more than you trust what a camera shows. The block settled back to its routine, but the damp marks at the takeoff spot stayed visible for a day, a plain reminder of how a few inches of slip can change a jump that looked simple on paper. It was June 20th, 2015, at a county fairgrounds in Ohio. A vintage 2-seat biplane sat near the show line, while a wing-walking setup with simple handholds and a tethered harness was checked one more time. Claire Mason was 37 years old and worked as a stunt performer. She had trained for years on older biplanes. She practiced low, straight passes and simple moves and kept her actions tight and repeatable. She cared about timing, handholds, and clear safety calls with the pilot. The pilot that day had the proper ratings and was known among show crews for smooth, steady controls. Mid-afternoon heat pushed temperatures near 90 degrees Fahrenheit, which means the hot, thin air makes wings and engines work less well. A large crowd lined the fence. On Claire's signal, the pilot brought the biplane down the runway for a flat pass to check power and control, then set up for the move that showed her moving from the center section toward the right wing. Before the move, the crew checked radio connections, safety rope clips, and hand signals. A light breeze moved across the field at about 6 to 8 miles per hour. The pilot began a climb to give room, then started a shallow turn so the crowd could see Claire's movement from the side. The airplane's nose came up as the speed dropped for the act. Claire stepped from the center post to the right wing area she had practiced many times. The pilot held a very slight bank and added power, but the hot air meant there was less lift than on cooler days. From the fence line, the airplane looked slow and nose high, with the upper wing blocking part of the body from view. A person with a video camera near midfield said later the plane stalled, then dropped like a door. The biplane shook, rolled toward the field, and came down in a steep path from a few hundred feet above the ground. The right wingtip hit first, followed by the nose and lower gear. A brief spray of dirt and parts marked the impact spot, inside the safety area and well away from the crowd. Show staff waved people back and used cones to widen the clear zone while emergency crews moved in. Fire and EMS units from the fairgrounds detail reached the site within moments. Fuel and battery switches were made safe, and fire equipment stood by as medics checked both people. Deputies and air show operations staff pushed the crowd line back and suspended the show. The field was closed and a temporary command post was set up near a hangar. Deputies took statements from witnesses, including the person with the video camera and photographers. The show's safety officer provided the pilot's paperwork and aircraft registration. A weather printout showed the temperature and pressure readings that explained the higher density altitude. By late afternoon, the coroner documented the scene and arranged transport. The wreckage was marked and guarded overnight. The next morning, investigators took custody for detailed examination, beginning with the engine, propeller, and controls. In the days that followed, they gathered engine data, maintenance logs, pilot records, and weather information. Video from several angles was also reviewed, with the focus on airspeed management and climb performance in the afternoon heat. The coroner listed blunt force trauma as the cause of death for both people. A joint memorial honored both Claire and the pilot at the airfield the following weekend. Flowers were placed at the edge of the runway. Aviation officials paused low-altitude stunt waivers at the venue and reminded airshow organizers to factor density altitude into show routines on hot days. It was April 16, 2018, near Page, Arizona. A plywood takeoff ramp faced a narrow desert cut in the ground, made of hard clay and sand. Ryan Cole was 35 years old and worked as a mechanic. He built bikes in his garage and rode at local stunt nights. He measured ramps with a tape-in level, marked run-ups with chalk, and checked engine settings twice before shows. He told friends this one was a short gap for the hometown crowd. His partner had warned him about the wind that morning. The cut in the ground was roughly 12 feet deep and about 30 to 35 feet across. The takeoff ramp stood about 4 feet high, built with lumber and covered with plywood. Across the gap, a landing pile of packed dirt rose a few feet above the far bank. A friend set up a camera on the landing side. By late morning, gusts pushed dust across the run-up. A handheld meter showed about 10 miles per hour with higher crosswind gusts. Ryan walked the run-up and wiped the ramp face with a towel, but fine dust and grit remained. He marked his steps with chalk, then rolled the bike back to a mark that gave him about 120 feet of run-up. He did 2 speed checks, rolling on and off the gas to feel the pull. The engine sounded clean on the straight, but coughed once when he revved at the bottom of the ramp. He pointed at the engine part, made a quick mixture change, and took one more pass. Sirens sounded from the highway, a mile away. The friend on the pile called that the camera was ready. Ryan went around, lined up, and opened the gas. The bike went straight on the hard ground. At the bottom of the ramp, he gave a final gas boost. The motor hesitated. The front wheel dipped as speed fell short. He reached the edge. The bike hesitated again, and the jump went flat. A security guard from a nearby business said later it sounded wrong at takeoff, like it lost breath. The front wheel hit the far edge of the cut. The bike tipped forward and fell into the cut. A dust cloud rose from the bottom. The friend on the pile ran to the edge and called 911, giving mile markers and a nearby crossroad. The guard moved cars back and kept people behind the cones. A deputy arrived first, followed by a fire unit and EMS. Crews went down into the cut with a backboard and secured the scene. The deputy noted wind conditions, ramp location, and distances with a laser measure. Investigators photographed the ramp face, chalk marks, and tire tracks. They measured the gap at 33 feet from edge to edge and recorded the run-up length and ramp height. The friend provided the camera card. The guard gave his statement. The deputy spoke with Ryan's partner, who confirmed the earlier warning about wind. After EMS confirmed fatal injuries, the coroner was notified. By early afternoon, the scene was cleared. The coroner documented the location and arranged transport. The deputy tagged the ramp and the bike as evidence and then released the scene to the property owner. A teardown of the motorcycle at Ryan's garage found a lean condition at throttle tip-in, matching the bog witnesses heard at the ramp. The cause of death was listed by the coroner as blunt force trauma. The funeral drew riders from 3 towns. His partner spoke briefly about patience and leaving projects unfinished. Deputies cited members of the crew for trespass and unsafe assembly on private land. The county later issued guidance on event permits and placed barriers to block access to that cut for future stunts. Within the local riding scene, the video became a training note rather than a clip to share. Riders repeated 3 points the next week. Test throttle response underload. Do not launch with dust on the face. And call it off if wind hits double digits with gusts. Thanks for watching. But remember, every climb, every jump carries its own cost. It was August 12, 2016, in Detroit, Michigan. The night was thick with summer humidity and the low rumble of engines outside a boxing club. The last card had ended hours earlier, but the tension in the air hadn't cooled. Marcus Mac DeLeon was 28, an amateur boxer with more anger than discipline. He worked delivery shifts for a courier service, scraping together entry fees for local bouts. His coaches said he had raw power, but no control, in or out of the ring. His main fixation was Terrence Cole, a a calm, methodical fighter who had beaten him cleanly on points just a week earlier. The loss festered. Mac told friends that Cole's post-fight grin was straight-up disrespect, that he needed to set the record straight. Detroit's club circuit was a mix of pride and small-time chaos. Fighters like Mac were half promoted by local gyms and half managed by their own bravado. The East Side Club's rear alley was a known hangout. Dim lighting, a dumpster, and a narrow exit to the street. That Friday, Terrence had another match on the same card. An exhibition meant to showcase his technique before a regional tournament. Mac wasn't on the roster. He showed up anyway, slipping through the crowd near the back with a hooded sweatshirt and his phone in his pocket. Around midnight, Terrence left through the side door with his trainer and a few friends, laughing as they reviewed the match. CCTV footage later showed Mac emerging seconds after. He crossed the lot fast. Witnesses said he shouted first, something about respect, about being set up. Terrence turned, calm but tired, gesturing toward his trainer as if to walk away. The footage caught the flash of a shove, then a blur of movement. Moments later, Terrence stumbled backward, clutching his side. Mac's arm moved again, deliberate and fast, before he backed away. Breathing hard, knife visible in his hand, Terrence collapsed beside the dumpster. His friends screamed for help while Mac disappeared into the dark. A bystander called 911 within 90 seconds of the fight ending. Police arrived within minutes. Terrence was still conscious when paramedics reached him, able to answer briefly before losing consciousness. But his condition deteriorated en route to Detroit Receiving Hospital. He was pronounced dead less than an hour later from massive internal bleeding. Investigators pieced the sequence together quickly. Security footage, multiple phone videos, and witness statements left little room for ambiguity. Mac's car was found abandoned 2 miles away. A search of his apartment revealed clothing with blood traces matching Terrence's DNA. The weapon, a folding knife, was recovered from a storm drain near the club. Mac was arrested at a cousin's house 2 days later without resistance. During interrogation, he claimed self-defense, but evidence contradicted him. The knife wounds were angled downward, consistent with aggression. Surveillance timestamps matched witness accounts to the second. At trial, prosecutors framed the killing as an escalation of obsession and humiliation. The defense called it a tragic street misunderstanding. Court transcripts showed Mac expressing regret, but never admitting intent. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before convicting Mac DeLeon of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 20 years in state prison. It was June 9, 2017, in Barcelona, Spain. The evening light fell softly over Plaza de la Vila. Crowds moved lazily between cafes and tram stops. No one noticed the man in the dark jacket at first, watching from the far side of the square, his stillness breaking the rhythm of the city. Marta Ruiz was 26, a language instructor at a small private academy in Gracia. Her work was steady, her students liked her, and she supplemented her modest income by tutoring tourists who wanted to sound local. She posted about everything: the best neighborhood bakeries, weekend hikes, exhibitions at the Museo Picasso. Her tone was warm and unguarded, the kind of friendliness that drew strangers easily. Among her followers was Raul Vendrell, a 29-year-old warehouse clerk. He lived alone in a small flat and worked night shifts, managing freight inventory for a shipping company. He rarely spoke to co-workers. What began as casual interest in Marta's posts became routine, then fixation. Each photo and caption seemed to him a message. Her meals, her gym sessions, even a brief mention of a new boyfriend triggered something sharp and restless in him. Raul studied the timing of her uploads, mapped her locations, and began frequenting the places she tagged. Marta blocked one of his accounts, forcing him to create alternate ones. That week, Marta had finished her spring term at the academy and met friends for dinner at a cafe near Plaza de la Vila. It was a mild evening, damp after light rain. Around 8 p.m., she said her goodbyes, shouldered her small purse, and walked toward her usual bus stop. Security footage later confirmed she lingered by the square fountain to check her phone before heading down Carrer de Sant Josep Oriol. Footage from a nearby cafe's security camera later captured another figure appearing moments later, matching Raul's build and gait. In the following minute of footage, Marta is seen adjusting her hair, unaware of the man closing in from behind. Witnesses later described hearing two sharp cracks, metallic, distinct from the street noise. Marta dropped immediately, collapsing onto the stone walkway near the fountain's rim. One round entered through her upper back, another through the left side of her neck, both fired from close range. Panic spread instantly as cafe patrons screamed and ducked for cover. The gunman stood over her briefly, motionless, then turned and walked swiftly toward the nearest alley. A street musician nearby ran for help. Police arrived within 4 minutes. Marta was found with faint pulse but severe blood loss. Paramedics worked to stabilize her before transport, but she was pronounced dead upon arrival at Hospital de Saint Pau. Traffic cameras and toll data tracked Raul's movements that night. He drove south toward his apartment near the industrial district, parked in the lot, and did not re-emerge. The next morning, his body was found hanging from a ceiling beam. Inside his flat, investigators found the handgun, later identified as a .32 caliber revolver. The weapon was unregistered and believed to have been purchased through an illegal private sale several months earlier. His laptop was also open on Marta's social media page. Files recovered from his hard drive included hundreds of saved images, location logs, and months of unsent letters addressed to her. A document titled "She Chose Wrong" outlined the sequence of the attack and his planned suicide. Police ruled the case a premeditated murder-suicide fueled by digital obsession and social fixation. Local authorities issued a statement urging caution over online exposure and routine sharing of personal information. The language school held a brief memorial, closing for 2 days. Marta Ruiz was buried in Montjuic Cemetery under a gray sky, her students leaving small folded notes in place of flowers. It was March 22nd, 2015, in a quiet cul-de-sac in suburban Nottinghamshire, England. By mid-morning, that silence would be broken by a single, dull explosion that shattered the calm and left a neighborhood staring at a blackened doorway. Helen Barrett was 52, a longtime resident of the estate and a part-time administrative clerk at a dental practice in nearby Newark. Her life had been quietly unraveling for nearly a year. After a messy separation from her ex-partner, Paul Barrett, she'd become entangled in custody disputes over shared property and finances. Neighbors described her as tense but polite, often stepping outside to smoke on the porch during calls that ended with slamming doors or raised voices. Paul, 54, had once worked as an electrician, but after the breakup, he drifted between odd jobs, showing up unannounced to argue or collect what he claimed was his. The separation grew into an escalating feud, marked by restraining orders and repeated police visits. The Barrett home was typical for the area. 2 stories, gas heating, and a small back garden bordered by hedges. Helen had recently complained about strange disturbances behind the property, lights flickering, the faint smell of gas near the kitchen vent, and footprints by the back fence. She mentioned these to friends and to local police, but nothing came of it. 2 days before the incident, she told a co-worker she thought Paul had been near the back of the house again. Their initial assumption was paranoia. That Sunday began uneventfully. Around 8:15 a.m., rain was falling lightly. Visibility was poor. Helen was likely in the kitchen, making tea or checking her phone. Forensic analysis would later suggest that someone had entered the rear garden, removed the access panel to the property's exterior gas meter box using a wrench or meter key, and interfered with the valve controlling flow to the internal system. The result was a slow, steady release of natural gas into the lower rooms. With the windows closed against the damp morning, the mixture thickened unnoticed. By 8:47 a.m., a spark from a light switch or the refrigerator's compressor relay triggered ignition. The pressure wave ripped through the kitchen and front hallway, blowing the front door off its hinges and sending fragments of glass and insulation across the street. The blast wasn't large enough to level the house, but strong enough to cause fatal internal injuries. A neighbor, stepping out for a newspaper, heard the boom and saw the front window collapse outward in a plume of smoke. Fire crews arrived within 10 minutes. Helen was found near the hallway, likely moving toward the door when the explosion occurred. Helen Barrett was pronounced dead at the scene once fire crews confirmed the property was safe for paramedics to enter. She had suffered massive internal trauma and burns consistent with close-range blast exposure. Fire investigators determined there were no signs of accelerant or electrical malfunction. The focus quickly shifted to the gas system. The main valve showed wrench marks, inconsistent with normal use, and residue of disturbed soil suggested recent tampering. CCTV footage from nearby homes captured Paul's car leaving the area less than 15 minutes before the blast. When police traced his movements, they found internet searches on his phone regarding gas pressure control and ignition times. A recorded call to a friend the previous week mentioned scaring her a bit, so she'll move out. During questioning, Paul denied intent to kill, claiming only to have wanted to cause damage. Forensic and digital evidence contradicted him. The prosecution argued the act was deliberate sabotage. The court, while accepting that murder was not proven, found him guilty of manslaughter due to reckless endangerment. He received a 17-year prison sentence. It was April 12, 2018, in Phoenix, Arizona. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the strip mall parking lot off 7th Street, where commuters drifted in and out of convenience stores, fast food chains, and small offices. It was an ordinary weekday scene, unremarkable, quiet. But beneath the surface, resentment and humiliation had been simmering for months, waiting for a chance to ignite. Samuel Ortega, 34, worked as a freelance graphic designer from a rented apartment downtown. He made a modest living producing branding kits and social media layouts for small businesses across the Phoenix area. He'd built a reputation for being sharp, reliable, and outspoken online, traits that helped attract clients, but also made him confrontational in local digital circles. Among those he crossed paths with was Victor Salas, 52, who owned a small print and souvenir shop not far from Samuel's usual haunts. Their conflict began over a failed project inquiry, but turned personal after Samuel mocked Victor's poorly written messages and thinly veiled harassment. Samuel's decision to post screenshots of those exchanges, captioned with biting commentary, spread quickly in local business groups. The post branded Victor as the creep from 7th Street. Within days, his shop's online reviews plummeted. He lost walk-ins, faced refunds, and grew increasingly paranoid that people recognized him. While Samuel moved on to new clients, Victor stewed in humiliation. His Facebook posts became erratic, rants about fake professionals and cowards hiding behind screens. For those around him, it looked like a man unraveling. That Friday afternoon, Samuel had arranged to meet a small business owner at the strip mall cafe to discuss a rebranding project. He posted about the meeting location publicly, tagging the cafe's name for exposure. Victor saw it within minutes. According to GPS data later retrieved from his truck, he left his shop less than 10 minutes after viewing the post. Samuel, unaware, had already finished the meeting and was loading his portfolio case into his compact hatchback. Security footage later showed Victor walking briskly toward him, gesturing with one hand, his other concealed near his waistband. The audio-less video captured a brief exchange, Samuel turning, arms slightly raised in a dismissive motion. Several witnesses described hearing one short argument, then a single gunshot that echoed across the parking lot. Samuel fell immediately, clutching his chest. Witnesses described a small caliber handgun, likely a .380 or 9mm pistol, consistent with the shell casing recovered at the scene. Victor returned to his truck immediately and drove away. A store employee who rushed outside found him unresponsive within a minute. Paramedics called by a bystander arrived quickly, but he was pronounced dead at the scene. The bullet entered Samuel's chest at a downward angle, penetrating his left lung. Detectives secured the scene within 20 minutes, recovering the casing, a single slug from the pavement, and multiple cell phone recordings from nearby witnesses. Police located Victor at his residence just before midnight. The gun was still in his vehicle, one round missing from the magazine. During questioning, he admitted to confronting Samuel but claimed the shooting was accidental. He failed a gunshot residue test, and ballistic comparison later confirmed the recovered slug matched his firearm. At trial, prosecutors presented a clear timeline supported by digital evidence and surveillance footage. The defense argued provocation, citing months of public ridicule. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before finding Victor Salas guilty of second-degree murder. He received a 28-year sentence without parole. The strip mall where the shooting occurred quietly replaced its lot cameras with newer, high-resolution models. For Samuel's clients and colleagues, his death became a cautionary story about online escalation. It was November 14, 2016, in Marseille, France. The narrow streets of the 6th arrondissement were unusually still, the smell of rain mixing with faint traces of yeast from the bakeries that defined the block. By dawn, that atmosphere would be gone, replaced by the flash of sirens and the scorched smell of fuel. Julien Mercier, 22, had been working at La Petite Brioche for just 6 months. He was quiet, careful, and often volunteered to stay late cleaning the proofers and kneading tables so the early team could start on time. He rented a modest apartment nearby and was known for saving nearly every euro for culinary school. His employer, Jean-Paul Martin, was respected for his skill, but infamous for his temper, especially toward Claude Morel, who owned the pastry shop next door. The two men had competed for customers for years, their feud extending from whispered complaints to public insults online. Julien avoided it, seeing himself as an employee, not a participant in the rivalry. Baking was physically demanding. Long hours, heat, and exact timing. Each night, Julien worked through rising temperatures and the low hum of industrial mixers, relying on routine and caution. The two shops shared a narrow service alley used for deliveries and trash disposal, lined with cardboard, flour bags, and empty crates. It wasn't unsafe, but the proximity meant that one accident could affect both establishments. Still, no one expected danger from outside. That Monday, Jean-Paul's frustration reached its peak. Days earlier, Claude had accused him of tax fraud publicly, embarrassing him before suppliers. Jean-Paul ranted to colleagues, threatening vague retaliation. Late that night, after locking up, Jean-Paul filled a fuel can from his garage, convinced that burning a few boxes behind Claude's store would send a message. He didn't know that Claude had asked Julien to stop by his bakery to help prep pastry dough for an early catering order. From reconstructed evidence, around midnight, Jean-Paul walked through the alley wearing gloves and a hooded jacket. He crouched at the rear entrance of Claude's pastry shop, poured accelerant over stacked cardboard, and struck a lighter. The fire ignited faster than he expected, feeding on the dry paper and plastic crates. Within seconds, it climbed the wall and flashed upward under the awning, creating a sudden surge of radiant heat. Jean-Paul fled immediately. Inside, Julien was rinsing trays when the lights flickered and smoke began seeping through the back door. He likely moved to investigate, but was met with a burst of superheated air from a flashover near the doorway. Two residents across the street reported seeing him at a side window, pounding against the glass as the interior filled with smoke. A neighbor's emergency call brought firefighters to the scene by 12:09 a.m., finding the structure engulfed. When they breached the rear, they discovered Julien collapsed near the exit, overcome by carbon monoxide. His burns were minimal, indicating death by asphyxiation. Forensic investigators recovered melted plastic traces consistent with fuel residue at the origin point. Security footage confirmed the masked arsonist's route, matching the frame of Jean-Paul's build. When questioned, he denied involvement, but later confessed after residue from the same accelerant was found on his gloves and jacket at home. In court, prosecutors demonstrated that while intent to kill was not proven, The deliberate ignition of flammable material caused a death. Jean-Paul Martin was convicted of involuntary homicide and aggravated arson, receiving an 18-year prison sentence. Julien's funeral was held quietly in his hometown of Avignon, attended by family, colleagues, and the few neighbors who knew him. The incident led to expanded fire safety inspections of small food businesses across Marseille, a silent acknowledgement that negligence and anger can burn far beyond their aim. It was August 22nd, 2015, in Cordoba, Argentina. The city was quieting after a humid Saturday, the kind of late winter evening when families filled roadside cafes before heading home. Streetlights blinked on along Avenida Rafael Núñez, illuminating the rows of parked cars and slow weekend traffic. Among them was a silver Renault Scenic, freshly serviced, its driver unaware that something beneath its frame had been left fatally altered. Diego Alvarez, 42, ran a small hardware store in the northern district. Known among friends as reliable and even-tempered, he balanced long work hours with coaching his son's youth soccer team on weekends. His life was defined by routine, steady work, steady income, and predictable commutes. He trusted local tradesmen and rarely questioned mechanical work, preferring to keep good relations with neighborhood service providers. That habit led him to a small repair shop managed by Rafael Delgado, a mechanic with a reputation for skill but an equally strong temper. Vehicles like Diego's Scenic required regular wheel alignment and hub checks due to the uneven road surfaces common around Cordoba's outskirts. It was standard service: removal, cleaning, torquing, and reseating of wheel nuts on fixed studs. The process demanded precision, but not specialized tools. On paper, there was nothing inherently dangerous about a routine service. But in mechanical systems, a single nut torqued incorrectly could turn a car into a weapon against itself. That week, Diego brought the car in for a brake inspection and tire rotation. When Rafael issued an inflated bill, Diego confronted him over what he called double charging. Witnesses recalled raised voices and Rafael pacing outside the office later that day. Surveillance from a nearby warehouse, later retrieved by investigators, captured Rafael returning to the yard after closing. He lingered near Diego's parked vehicle for several minutes, appearing to work on something near the front wheel before walking away. The following afternoon, Diego picked up the car, paid reluctantly, and tried to drive home. At 6:43 p.m., a municipal dashcam positioned along Avenida Gauss captured the moment everything went wrong. Diego's car drifted slightly right, corrected, then suddenly lurched left. The front wheel detached cleanly from the hub, bouncing ahead as the chassis dug into the pavement. The vehicle rolled once, striking a lamppost and landing on its roof. Witnesses rushed from nearby vehicles. Two men broke the passenger window and cut the seatbelt. Diego was semi-conscious, but pinned against the steering column. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but he succumbed to chest trauma before reaching the hospital. Police impounded the wreck and began a technical inspection. Mechanics documented cross-threaded and partially loosened wheel nuts, inconsistent torque pressure, and distinct tool markings suggesting deliberate tampering. Microscopic residue from the wheel studs matched traces found on gloves Rafael was using. When confronted, Rafael claimed sabotage by another worker, but forensic alignment between his wrench set and the damage pattern closed the case. Rafael Delgado was charged with aggravated homicide and found guilty. Prosecutors cited motive, opportunity, and physical evidence showing calculated tampering. He received a 23-year sentence. Diego's widow petitioned the provincial legislature for mandatory surveillance in licensed garages, a measure proposed later that year and enacted the following spring. Today, most workshops in Cordoba operate under continuous camera coverage, a direct result of a tragedy that began with pride, ended in negligence, and cost a family its center. It was June 18, 2015, and the city was trading sun for wind. Mitchell Grant, 34, facade technician for a mid-sized renovation crew, careful and methodical by nature, was wrapping a long day on a 2-point suspension scaffold at the northeast face of a mid-rise. Nearby moved a temporary rigger, Wade Thompson, 36, impatient and resentful, the kind who rushed checklists and bristled at reminders. A week earlier, Mitchell's report had cost Wade a full-time contract. He'd spent the rest of the week seething, calling Mitchell a rules-obsessed snitch. Watching from the ground was the site supervisor, 45, by the book and steady. A week earlier, a complaint noted excess slack on lifelines and a sharp-edged bracket where a secondary line passed, a weakness Wade may have exploited rather than created. Mitchell's task was modest, patching and sealant touch-ups near the 10th floor. He clipped in, tested his weight, and adjusted the lanyard gate. Debris nets were tight, the drop zone coned off, pedestrians sparse. The wind pushed and released in irregular breaths. When the hoist engaged for a small raise, no more than 3 feet, the left tie-in jolted. The scaffold deck trembled, pushing a lifeline across that old bracket. The secondary line had wear that didn't belong. The jacket split under load, and the primary line, already abraded, took the shock. The platform tipped. Mitchell's right boot caught the toe board. Momentum folded him over the mid-rail. The fall arrest system did not engage. Later inspection revealed the lanyard snap hook had been threaded backward through the D-ring, secure at a glance, but useless under load. He fell past the lit windows. A projecting setback met him first. The right side of his skull struck. The ledge forced his chest into the edge, fracturing ribs and disrupting breathing. The right femur broke on the stone lip. The spine suffered at the cervical level. He fell again to the exclusion zone below, landing on his left side. The injuries were the kind that remove options. The skull fracture depressed the bone into the brain tissue. Multiple rib fractures compressed the thorax. The femur broke internally. The neck injury risked the pathways that drive respiration. Witnesses reported a double impact that echoed between buildings. The supervisor ran for the gate, radio in hand. Responders found a pulseless, unresponsive patient with absent breathing. Pupils were fixed. Compressions began, airway maneuvers followed, and a monitor drew a straight line. Nothing shifted the course. Death was confirmed. Attention turned to the scaffold and gear. The secondary lifeline showed damage at a clean angle where it met the bracket, inconsistent with normal wear. The primary line bore marks that didn't fit everyday abrasion. Inventory revealed a missing cutting tool. Interviews documented strained exchanges between Mitchell and the temporary rigger over safety reminders. The supervisor produced earlier notes about slack on lifelines. When investigators reviewed site CCTV, they found Wade Thompson returning alone to the platform an hour before startup, carrying his cutting tool. Photographs fixed the positions, platform angle, bracket alignment, and the path the lines had followed. Measurements noted distances from rail to ledge to pavement. Weather records marked gusts that could aggravate but not explain the simultaneous failure of redundancies. Reconstruction concluded that equipment condition and line integrity were incompatible with routine wear. The narrative that emerged was not of a bad moment in the wind, but of a sequence made possible before anyone stepped onto the platform. The supervisor closed the binder on the earlier complaint, now part of a chain. Co-workers spoke of a man who liked procedures and kept his harness clean. The building continued to rise, the facade patching reassigned, the scaffold sealed for examination. Wade Thompson resigned the next day and disappeared before police completed interviews. On paper, the cause read, blunt force trauma from a fall. On the ground, the change was an absence at a mid-rail, where a careful worker had laid his glove while checking a line. It was November 12, 2015, and the evening shift at the regional hospital was winding down. Courtney Blake, 29, a respiratory therapist with a reputation for thoroughness, was gathering her things from the staff locker room. Her compact sedan waited in the multi-level parking garage 3 floors up. What she didn't know was that her former partner, Erica Lawson, 31, a retail clerk with meticulous habits and a passive-aggressive streak, had been tracking her schedule for weeks. The breakup 6 months earlier had left property disputes unresolved. Courtney had mentioned that her car had been pulling left and vibrating after low-speed turns. 2 tire pressure warnings had appeared recently, but visual inspection showed nothing wrong. What wasn't visible was that the lug nuts had been systematically loosened, just enough to allow gradual elongation of the stud holes under normal driving stress. The parking garage's descending spiral ramp had concrete barriers and a damp surface from recent drizzle. Courtney started her descent at a reasonable speed, unaware that her former partner had spent time earlier that week with a lug wrench, carefully backing off each nut to a precise tension that would hold under parking lot speeds but fail under the lateral forces of the curved ramp. As the sedan began its descent, the left front corner exhibited increased shimmy that grew with each turn. A metallic rattle developed as the wheel, with compromised lug nuts, began to wobble against elongated stud holes. At the third turn, the left front wheel sheared completely free. The wheel separation was catastrophic. The hub dropped, scraping the brake rotor against concrete in a shower of sparks. The vehicle yawed hard left as steering became uncontrollable. The rims struck the concrete barrier with tremendous force, triggering rapid deceleration that threw Courtney against her shoulder belt. Airbags deployed with explosive force, causing facial abrasions. The impact caused the car to mount the curb lip. The undercarriage snagged, acting as a pivot point that caused the vehicle to rotate and impact the support pillar with the driver's side. The pillar strike compressed the left side of the passenger compartment. Courtney sustained multiple left side rib fractures, a pulmonary contusion that compromised breathing, a splenic laceration that began bleeding internally, and a left clavicle fracture. The compression accelerated internal bleeding from her damaged spleen. Her breath sounds diminished rapidly as blood filled her chest cavity. A garage attendant arrived within minutes, noted her shallow breathing was slowing, and called emergency services. Investigation revealed the deliberate nature of the wheel failure. All 5 lug nuts were found partially threaded with matching tool marks, inconsistent with professional service. Surveillance footage showed Erica Lawson's vehicle entering the structure multiple times during the previous week. Accident reconstruction confirmed the lug nuts had been intentionally loosened to a specific tension that would allow normal operation while ensuring failure under lateral forces. Police arrested Erica Lawson 3 days later at her retail workplace. She was charged with first-degree murder and tampering with a motor vehicle. During interrogation, she initially denied involvement, but broke down when confronted with the surveillance evidence. 8 months later, she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. It was April 23, 2016, and the pre-dawn air at the small public marina carried the chill of early spring. Adrian Wells, 41, independent marine mechanic with calloused hands, had agreed to meet at the wooden dock to check an engine noise. His small outboard skiff bobbed against the weathered planks. What Adrian didn't know was that his former business associate, Zane Mitchell, 44, an independent contractor with calculating eyes, had arrived earlier under the pretense of returning borrowed tools. The partnership had dissolved 6 months earlier over disputed debts. A fisherman, 59, quiet and methodical, was preparing tackle at a nearby slip. Adrian had mentioned that his stern line seemed loose, and he'd noticed that a dock cleat had been rebolted with mismatched screws. Adrian stepped aboard his skiff and tugged the bowline to test its security. The cleat, which had been pre-scored at its base with deliberate cuts, held under gentle tension. He started the engine at idle to listen for the irregular noise. He shifted his weight toward the stern to release that line. With his full weight on the bow line, the compromised cleat reached its failure point. The metal sheared cleanly at the scored base, and the line whipped free. Adrian lost his footing on the wet planks, slick from overnight condensation. He slipped between the dock and boat just as the skiff's lateral motion compressed his chest against the hard dock edge. The impact fractured multiple ribs, creating a flail segment that made breathing difficult. The compression caused a liver laceration, leading to internal bleeding. As he struggled in the cold water, the boat's propeller wash pushed the stern away. The cold water triggered a shock response that impaired his coordination. Adrian's personal flotation device remained in the storage hatch, unworn. The outboard engine continued running, and the boat drifted as he struggled to stay afloat. His head was submerged repeatedly as he fought against the cold water and compromised breathing. Water aspiration began immediately, leading to hypoxia as his damaged chest made breathing nearly impossible. The fisherman heard the engine noise change and the splash. He grabbed a boat hook and rushed toward the sound, but by the time he reached Adrian, the combination of cold water shock, chest trauma, and water aspiration had taken its toll. The fisherman pulled Adrian partially onto the dock using the boat hook, but found no detectable pulse or breathing. Hypoxic cardiac arrest followed quickly, secondary to drowning and blunt chest trauma. The fisherman immediately began CPR while calling for emergency services, but Adrian remained unresponsive. Emergency medical services arrived and continued resuscitation efforts, but Adrian could not be revived. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The investigation focused on the failed dock cleat. Examination revealed deliberate scoring marks at its base and improper replacement screws inconsistent with marine hardware standards. Metal filings were found near the base, suggesting recent tampering. Security cameras recorded Zane Mitchell's presence at the dock earlier that evening, carrying a tool bag. The fisherman confirmed that the cleat failure preceded Adrian's fall. Investigators photographed the failed cleat, replacement screws, and metal filings. The deliberate scoring and inappropriate hardware pointed to sabotage rather than normal wear. Zane's presence, combined with financial disputes from their dissolved partnership, provided sufficient evidence for his arrest 2 weeks later. He was charged with first-degree murder and destruction of property. It was September 14, 2016, and the loading dock of the local warehouse hummed with afternoon operations. Vanessa Reed, 26, an inventory supervisor with sharp attention to detail, was directing the staging order for expedited shipments. She had the kind of methodical approach that made her valuable to management and occasionally irritating to workers who preferred shortcuts. What she didn't know was that a former temp worker, Kayla Norton, 32, irritable and impulsive, had been rehired for seasonal shifts and was still nursing resentment from conflicts they'd had over inventory audits months earlier. Recent reports had noted loosened shrink wrap on heavy pallets and a missing wheel chock at a frequently used staging bay. The loading dock operated with constant activity and intermittent forklift traffic. Vanessa was supervising counts when she needed to guide a manual pallet jack around a blind corner near a rolling door. The pallet carried stacked cartons nearing the height limit, secured with shrink wrap that appeared intact. As Vanessa maneuvered around the blind corner, the top tier began to lean due to the shrink wrap that had been deliberately loosened at key stress points. A forklift entered the adjacent lane, and Vanessa halted to avoid a collision. The sudden stop created momentum that shifted the load forward, and the compromised wrapping could no longer maintain stack integrity. The top layer began to slide, and a corner carton caught on the pallet edge, causing the entire upper portion to tilt toward Vanessa. She stepped backward to clear the falling load, but her heel caught in a worn seam in the concrete floor. Balance was lost at the critical moment. The compromised stack collapsed with multiple heavy cartons impacting her upper body. The falling mass struck her across the chest and neck, creating immediate severe trauma. She sustained a cervical spine fracture from direct impact, multiple rib fractures from crushing weight, and thoracic compression that led to rapid airway compromise. The falling cartons pinned her across the chest and neck, creating a compression injury that immediately affected her breathing. The audible wheeze initially present ceased as the airway became completely compromised. Nearby workers, including the forklift operator, immediately rushed to lift the cartons and free her. The forklift operator dismounted and assisted with carton removal while calling emergency services. By the time they cleared enough weight to assess Vanessa's condition, she showed no effective breathing pattern and no palpable pulse. The mechanism of death was acute traumatic asphyxia resulting from chest and neck compression, combined with cervical spine injury that damaged neurological pathways controlling respiration. Paramedics confirmed a systole upon arrival and initiated advanced cardiac life support, but the severity of crushing injuries made resuscitation impossible. Vanessa was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigation revealed deliberate cuts in the shrink wrap that undermined tension on top tiers and a missing wheel chock that should have prevented pallet movement. Security cameras showed the former temp worker in the area earlier that day, removing wrap sections and repositioning the wheel chock. The footage showed deliberate tampering with the load securing system. Kayla Norton was arrested at her apartment the following morning and charged with second-degree murder and workplace sabotage. During questioning, she admitted to loosening the shrink wrap out of spite, but claimed she never intended to kill anyone. Witness statements corroborated the sequence: sudden stop, lean of the top tier, stack collapse, and immediate entrapment. The investigation concluded that the primary cause was deliberate sabotage of the pallet's load securing system by someone with warehouse knowledge and staging area access. It was February 8, 2017, and the industrial quarry overlooked near the small town was wrapped in cold, dry air that made metal brittle and footing treacherous. Sean Porter, 38, freelance safety inspector with weathered hands and a cautious nature, had agreed to meet at the quarry rim to view surplus tools. He was the kind of man who double-checked harness stitching and never rushed safety protocols. What he didn't know was that his rival freelancer, Colby Andrews, 40, taciturn and competitive, had arrived earlier under the pretense of showing Sean potential equipment for sale. The two had been competing for the same clients, and a recent dispute had left bitter feelings unresolved. The quarry rim stretched along a dramatic drop, with loose gravel scattered near the edge and limited lighting. A security guard, 63, semi-retired and friendly, was making routine perimeter checks. Sean's safety harness had been inspected recently, with all stitching intact. However, his secondary lanyard showed fresh, unusual wear at the webbing edge. The equipment included basic climbing gear with single and secondary lanyards, designed to anchor to a steel post at the rim. Sean clipped the primary lanyard to the post, testing the connection. Colby suggested that Sean test the line tension while leaning outward to inspect a crate of tools on a ledge below. As Sean leaned outward, the load shifted to the secondary lanyard for slack management. The secondary lanyard, pre-weakened by partial internal cuts invisible from outside, tore under the sudden load transfer. The webbing separated along deliberately scored lines. Sean lost his footing on loose gravel, small stones rolling away under his boots. As he slipped over the rim, the primary lanyard caught momentarily, jerking tight against the anchor point. However, the anchor carabiner had been reoriented by Colby Andrews earlier, positioning it to create cross-loading under stress. The carabiner failed when loaded perpendicular to its intended orientation. Sean fell a significant distance to a rocky ledge jutting from the quarry wall. The impact with the ledge was devastating. He sustained bilateral lower limb fractures, a pelvic fracture, and internal injuries consistent with high-energy trauma. His breathing became shallow as internal bleeding began. The ledge, weakened by weather and blasting, crumbled under the impact. The unstable ledge gave way, and Sean fell again to the quarry floor far below. The second impact caused severe thoracic trauma and probable aortic injury as his chest struck the rocky bottom. Distant workers heard two distinct impacts and alerted security. When responders reached him, they found no carotid pulse and unresponsive pupils. CPR was initiated immediately, but there was no return of spontaneous circulation. The mechanism of death was catastrophic internal hemorrhage from blunt force trauma, including suspected rupture of major blood vessels. Emergency medical services declared death after prolonged resuscitation attempts failed. The combination of fall distance, rocky landing surfaces, and severity of internal injuries had created trauma incompatible with survival. The investigation focused on the harness and anchor system. Inspection revealed internal webbing cuts in the secondary lanyard not visible externally, indicating deliberate sabotage. The carabiner exhibited stress marks consistent with cross-loading failure, and its orientation was inconsistent with proper safety practices. Footprint analysis around the anchor post showed evidence of Colby Andrews' earlier movements, and gravel scuff marks indicated staged positioning near the rim. Security logs confirmed Colby's vehicle at the gate that evening. Police arrested Colby Andrews at his home 5 days later. The investigation concluded that equipment failures were the result of deliberate tampering designed to create a fatal accident while appearing to be equipment failure and user error. It was August 15, 2018, and the Riverside Park footbridge was bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. Melanie Cross, 33, a pediatric nurse with gentle hands and a patient demeanor, had agreed to meet on the bridge to resolve a dispute that had been festering for weeks. She preferred to handle conflicts in public settings, believing that open spaces would keep conversations civil. What she didn't anticipate was the volatile nature of her acquaintance, Sabrina Holt, 35, outwardly agreeable but confrontational under stress. The footbridge stretched across the river with wooden planks that had been slick from recent rain. A maintenance note had been filed about algae growth on the bridge planks, and park staff had reported that a rail bolt had worked loose. A jogger, 28, was present for her regular evening run across the bridge. The bridge showed signs of deferred maintenance, with warning signs about slippery surfaces and a partially loose rail segment. Melanie arrived at the agreed time and positioned herself near the center of the bridge. Sabrina Holt approached with a normal demeanor, carrying what looked like a borrowed item being returned. The conversation began calmly, but Sabrina's underlying stress quickly surfaced. Park staff had previously documented a public argument between the two, establishing a pattern of escalating conflict. The verbal exchange escalated rapidly from discussion to argument, then crossed into physical confrontation as Sabrina's frustration boiled over. The confrontation involved physical jostling near the rail, with Sabrina Holt pushing Melanie toward the loose rail segment. The loose rail segment shifted under the pressure, providing no stable support. Her left foot slipped on algae that had accumulated on the wet planks. The combination of the push, the failing rail, and the slippery surface sent her over the side of the bridge. Melanie rotated as she fell, striking a protruding rock on the embankment below with the right side of her head. The impact was devastating, causing a severe skull fracture with immediate subdural hemorrhage. She also sustained a right scapular fracture and multiple superficial abrasions. Her respiration became irregular immediately following the head impact, then became shallow and increasingly ineffective as intracranial pressure from bleeding began to affect the brain centers controlling breathing. The jogger heard the scuffle followed by the impact and immediately changed course to investigate. She reached the embankment and called for help. Melanie exhibited non-purposeful movements initially, but these ceased within minutes. When the jogger reached her, she found no palpable pulse and no effective breathing pattern. The mechanism of death was traumatic brain injury with rapid intracranial bleeding that led to respiratory arrest and cardiac arrest. The severity of the skull fracture had damaged critical areas controlling vital functions. Emergency medical services arrived and began advanced life support measures, but the severe traumatic brain injury and elapsed time made resuscitation impossible. Melanie was pronounced dead at the scene. The investigation focused on the fall circumstances and the bridge infrastructure condition. Inspection revealed that the rail bolt had backed out partially, creating instability. Analysis of Melanie's shoe treads showed algae residue consistent with slipping. Park security cameras captured both individuals' approach and positioning near the rail during the confrontation. Witness accounts aligned consistently. Escalating argument, physical confrontation, involving pushing, slip on wet surface, fall over compromised rail, head impact on rocks, and immediate unresponsiveness. Sabrina Holt was arrested at the scene by responding officers after the jogger identified her as the person who pushed Melanie. She was initially charged with manslaughter, but after reviewing the security footage and witness testimony, prosecutors upgraded the charges to second-degree murder, arguing that pushing someone toward a compromised bridge rail showed depraved indifference to human life. The investigation concluded that deferred maintenance, hazardous surface conditions, and deliberate physical confrontation created a scenario where a dispute became fatal due to environmental factors and Sabrina Holt's aggressive behavior. It was March 3, 2016, in Helsinki, Finland, and the winter evening was quiet. The streets were damp from melting snow, and neon signs reflected off the wet pavement. In the Kallio district, a small fitness center was closing for the night. Jukka Lehtinen, a 52-year-old gym owner known for strict discipline, had spent decades in the fitness business. He was tough on his staff and often called out their mistakes in front of members. His style was old school and unforgiving. A few weeks earlier, he had a heated clash with one of his trainers, Kari Niemi. During a busy session, Jukka accused him of being careless with equipment and unprofessional with clients. He raised his voice and pointed his finger while members watched from nearby machines. The confrontation embarrassed Kari in front of everyone. His face flushed red as he tore off his staff shirt and walked out. He left the gym that day and told others he would never forgive Jukka for what had happened. Jukka followed the same routine every night, and Kari knew it well. After the last members left, Juka always ended his shift with a solo sauna session. Same pattern, same time, like clockwork. Kari still had a spare key that he never returned. One evening, he slipped inside after hours. The gym was empty and silent. He moved to the sauna's control box and disabled the automatic shutoff that kept the heat from climbing too high. Then he wedged the outside latch with a metal shim so the door could not be opened from inside. He tested it once to make sure it held. Satisfied, he left quietly through the back exit. The following night, Juka followed his routine. Around 10 p.m., he walked through the locker room with a towel over his shoulder and stepped into the sauna. A cleaner sweeping the hall noticed him enter. At first, nothing seemed wrong. 10 minutes later, the cleaner walked past again and paused. Thick steam was rolling under the door. From inside came dull thumps, heavy and uneven. The cleaner thought Juka was shifting on the bench or tossing water onto the hot rocks, but the sound sharpened like fists striking wood. He called out but got no response. The cleaner tugged at the handle, but the latch would not move. It felt jammed tight. Worried, he rushed to the supply closet and grabbed a metal bar used for weight racks. His hands shook as he searched through the shelves. By the time he returned with another staff member, the pounding had stopped. Together, they forced the latch open. The door groaned and then swung outward. A wave of heat surged into the hall, thick and choking. Inside, the benches were soaked. Steam clung to every surface, and the air burned to breathe. Juka was collapsed on the middle bench, motionless. His skin was flushed a deep red, and his towel was darkened at the edges. Later checks showed the sauna had climbed past 220 degrees Fahrenheit, far beyond safe limits. The cleaner backed away in shock. The room was so hot that they could not stand inside for more than a few seconds. What was once a place of calm had turned into a furnace. Investigators arrived later that night. They found the safety timer had been tampered with and the latch jammed from the outside. It was not a simple malfunction. Someone had prepared the trap. Tool marks on the control box matched wrenches missing from the locker Kari Niemi once used, and his spare key was recovered during a search of his apartment. He was arrested within days, and the case was ruled a calculated act of revenge. The gym closed for a week. Members spoke in hushed voices about the owner who lost his life in the very place he trusted most. It was September 12, 2015, in Tuscany, Italy, and the hillsides were quiet as evening settled. The air was heavy with the smell of grapes during harvest season. On the edge of Chianti country, a small vineyard was prepared for another long night of work. Running this estate was Paolo Ricci, a 61-year-old co-owner who had spent his life building the family business. Paolo was known for his sharp business sense and stubborn decisions. He ran the vineyard with an iron grip and rarely backed down from a fight. Earlier that year, he forced his cousin, Marco Ricci, out of the partnership after a bitter dispute over finances. Paolo claimed Marco had been mismanaging funds and making poor choices that hurt the business. Many workers whispered that Marco had taken the loss hard. For decades, he had labored in the same fields alongside Paolo, only to watch his name removed from contracts and his influence stripped away. He rarely spoke to the family after the split, but people noticed him walking the edge of the vineyard rows more than once, watching in silence from a distance. Marco knew the property better than anyone. He also knew the dangers inside the underground wine cellar. The sealed stone room held fermenting barrels that released carbon dioxide, a gas heavier than air. If trapped inside without proper ventilation, the buildup could suffocate a person within minutes. Marco had helped design the cellar years earlier, and he remembered every latch, every vent, and every corner. That knowledge became the center of his plan for revenge. On a late summer evening, Marco returned to the estate under the cover of darkness. The harvest kept everyone distracted in the fields, their voices carrying across the rows. He carried a small tube of industrial glue and slipped into the cellar corridor. The heavy oak door had a simple latch, one that could be sealed quickly by forcing a thin bead of glue directly into the mechanism. He coated it carefully, working slowly to avoid making noise. Then he waited for his chance. That night, Marco approached Paolo with a calm suggestion. The barrels, he said, might be over-fermenting. He urged Paolo to check them before morning or risk losing an entire batch. To a man like Paolo, whose pride rested on the quality of his wine, such a warning could not be ignored. Paolo trusted his own judgment above all and decided to inspect the cellar himself. A field hand later recalled seeing Paolo descend into the cellar around midnight, a lantern in one hand and a clipboard in the other. The worker thought nothing of it until some time passed and faint banging came from behind the door. The sound was weak as though muffled by thick stone walls. When the worker tried the latch, it refused to turn. It was stuck solid. The worker called for help. Others arrived and tried forcing the door, but the latch would not budge. The banging grew less frequent, then stopped. No one knew how long Paolo had struggled inside, surrounded by the invisible gas rising from the barrels. The lantern's glow faded until the cellar returned to silence. By dawn, worried workers gathered in the corridor. They pried at the latch with iron bars until the door splintered open. A rush of stale air spilled out. Inside, Paolo was slumped against the largest barrel, his lantern cold beside him. The air smelled strongly of fermenting grapes, sharp and suffocating. His face was drained of color, his body still. Investigators found the latch had been glued to the mechanism. Traces of the same industrial adhesive were traced to a tube Marco purchased in Siena weeks earlier, and a partial fingerprint in the dried glue matched his record. Confronted with the evidence, Marco admitted he had prepared the trap. He was arrested, and the case was ruled an act of revenge carried out with knowledge only a vintner could possess. The vineyard never stopped. Harvest continued that same week, though workers moved through the rows in silence. For them, the vines were no longer just a source of wine, but a reminder of how one family feud had ended in calculated death. It was July 18, 2018, in Singapore, and the night air was warm and heavy. Rain from earlier in the evening still clung to the streets, and the glow from streetlights reflected off the wet pavement. At the edge of the central district, the main city library was winding down for the day. Running this busy facility was Daniel Wong, a 44-year-old head librarian known for being methodical, keeping the building's operations running with strict routines and careful oversight. Earlier that year, safety checks revealed repeated problems with the elevators and other systems. The library's maintenance supervisor, Lee Han, had been warned several times to keep up with inspections, but failed to file reports on time. After several missed deadlines, Daniel dismissed him from his position. Lee left the job quietly, but he carried years of technical knowledge of the building and a growing resentment toward the man who had forced him out. Lee knew the library building better than anyone. For years, he had handled its mechanical systems, including the service elevators used by staff to move supplies between floors. He knew every override panel, every interlock, and every shutoff switch hidden in the service corridors. He understood how the safety systems worked and how they could be disabled. Losing his job did not take away that knowledge, and it was that knowledge he would later use for revenge. On a quiet evening, weeks later, Lee entered the library's service area after hours. Using an old access code he had never returned, he bypassed the electronic lock and slipped into the narrow corridor behind the staff elevators. The hallway was dim and silent, lit only by a single emergency light. There, he disabled the safety interlock that prevented elevators from moving when maintenance was underway. He also bypassed the kill switch designed to keep the cab stationary when someone was on top of it. He worked carefully, making sure each wire was disconnected in a way that would not trigger an alarm. The trap was set. He left the building the same way he came in, unnoticed. The next morning, Lee phoned the library's service desk from a prepaid mobile phone. He reported that one of the staff lifts was jammed between floors and acting strangely. Daniel, known for being hands-on and unwilling to wait for outside help, decided to inspect it himself before calling for professional repair. He grabbed a flashlight from his office and headed toward the dim corridor leading to the service shaft. A junior staffer later recalled seeing Daniel step into the narrow passage, his flashlight beam cutting across the concrete walls. The staffer heard him muttering about checking the car roof for a mechanical fault. He said something about it probably being a loose cable or misaligned sensor. Moments later, the service elevator groaned and began to rise, even though no call button had been pressed. The movement was slow at first, then faster. A sudden shout echoed inside the shaft. The staffer froze in place, unsure of what was happening. Then came a metallic clatter, the sound of Daniel's flashlight striking the concrete floor below. By the time the worker reached the doorway and looked inside, the sounds had already gone silent. The elevator had stopped moving. When others arrived and the power was cut to the system, the elevator was found pressed tight against the top of the shaft. Daniel had climbed onto the cab roof to inspect the mechanism and was pinned in the narrow ceiling space above, his body wedged between steel and concrete. There had been less than a foot of clearance. The damage was instant and fatal. Investigators discovered the interlock had been manually bypassed and the kill switch disabled. Security footage showed a man entering the service corridor the night before using an old access code. His build and gait matched Lee Han, the former supervisor, In his apartment, police later found tools coated with grease from the library's elevator system and printouts of the building's mechanical diagrams. He was arrested within a week, and the case was ruled a premeditated act of revenge carried out with technical precision. It was May 30th, 2015, in Key Largo, Florida, and the morning was clear and calm. The water was flat inside the reef line, and charter boats idled along the channel. On a small dive boat tied off near a coral wall, students listened to a short briefing before their first descent. Leading the group was Mark Grant, a 32-year-old scuba instructor at a small neighborhood dive club. Mark worked year-round teaching entry-level classes. In the weeks before the dive, rumors spread that he had started seeing the girlfriend of one of the club's advanced divers. The rival was older, bitter, and had keys to the gear shed from past volunteer work. He knew the equipment well, where the compressors were and which tanks Mark used. Mark's cylinders were easy to spot with his initials stenciled near the boot. Late one night, the rival unlocked the storage cage and rolled Mark's favorite tank to the bench near the compressor room. He cracked the valve to bleed it down to zero, then clipped a whip from a tall supply bottle and refilled the cylinder with pure nitrogen. He set the pressure to normal, about 3,000 psi, so the gauge would look right in the morning. He wiped the tank with a rag, returned it to the rack, and locked the cage behind him. The swap took only minutes. There was no analyzer on the club table because the class was using standard air, not nitrox. No one would think to test it. The next day, the group prepared for a training dive to 40 feet along a coral wall. Mark checked his gear on the boat deck. He opened his valve, checked his pressure, and took a few breaths from the regulator. Everything seemed normal. Nitrogen feels no different until you're under pressure. The hiss was clean. The gauge read full. The group descended in pairs. An eyewitness student said Mark led at the front, a few yards above the sand. 5 minutes into the dive, his movements changed. He reached for the line but missed. His kicks became erratic. His eyes appeared glassy behind the mask, and his movements lost coordination. He fumbled with his regulator, and it slipped from his mouth. Bubbles frosted his mask as it flooded. A diver next to him tried to donate air with an octopus regulator, but Mark did not bite down. His hands were slow and uncoordinated, moving as though he could not understand what was happening. In seconds, he went limp. The assistant diver grabbed his harness and began a controlled ascent, kicking hard toward the surface. But the class had spread out along the reef. 2 more students surfaced early in a panic, waving at the boat and shouting for help. The captain threw a tagline and radioed for emergency help. When the crew rolled Mark over the transom, he was unresponsive. Another dive boat had sent down a rescue diver to help lift him from the bottom after he began to sink. That diver later said only Mark's gear looked wrong. Everyone else returned, breathing hard but normal. Back at the dock, the club quarantined the equipment. The sheriff's office sealed the cylinder and took it for testing. The gas analysis told the story. The seized tank showed no measurable oxygen, only nitrogen. The other students' cylinders, sampled from the same fill batch, tested as normal compressed air at roughly 21% oxygen. The problem was not the compressor or the boat. It was a single tank. Investigators pulled the shop's entry logs and camera clips from the alley behind the gear shed. The night before the dive, the rival's key fob opened the cage just before 10:45 p.m. A security camera caught his truck backing up to the side door and his silhouette moving across the compressor room window. In his garage, deputies found a valve wrench with fresh tool marks and a partially drained industrial nitrogen bottle used for gas blending. His phone showed a late-night search for an oxygen analyzer, not required for air. Confronted with the test results and the entry logs, he admitted he had swapped a tank to teach him a lesson. He was arrested within days. The case was ruled a premeditated act of revenge carried out with simple knowledge of scuba equipment. The club padlocked its gear shed and posted a sign on the counter: analyzers required for any personal cylinders. Word spread fast along the Florida Keys. Divers talked quietly about how a normal gauge reading and a familiar hiss could still hide an empty breath. It was November 6th, 2015, in London, and the rain had just cleared from the West End streets. Inside the Harrington Playhouse, rehearsals were underway on the dim stage. Among the cast was Simon Gray, a 26-year-old understudy who had recently been promoted to a lead role. Simon had stepped in after the original actor, Edward Price, left in anger. Edward had been vocal about losing the part, arguing with directors and crew before storming out. Though dismissed, he still knew the theater well. Before acting, Edward had worked stagehand jobs where he learned the ropes, pulleys, and counterweight systems that moved curtains and backdrops. That knowledge would later become the means of his revenge. The counterweight system used in the Harrington Playhouse was old but effective. Sandbags balanced the heavy curtains and scenery flats, allowing a single person to raise or lower them. Each weight was stitched in canvas and stacked neatly in the fly loft above the stage. In the dark, they all looked the same. Edward knew he could tamper with one without raising suspicion. On a quiet night before rehearsal, he entered through a side door using the access card he still had. Stagehands often left latches loose, so no one noticed he was inside. He located the set of weights assigned to the main curtain and removed one sandbag. In its place, he hung a look-alike sack filled not with sand, but a solid concrete block weighing nearly 80 pounds. He stitched the canvas tight to hide the shape, brushed dust across the seams, and returned the line to its original position. To the eye, nothing looked unusual. To the hand, the weight felt the same on the rope until it dropped. The following afternoon, the cast gathered for rehearsal. The house lights were dimmed, and only the stage lamps burned. Simon stood at the wing, following cues with the script tucked under one arm. As part of his entrance, he needed to pull the curtain line. Several actors nearby remembered watching him step to the rope, plant his feet, and give it a firm tug. At first, the curtain shifted normally. Then came the sound of a rope hissing through pulleys, followed by a sharp crack overhead. Before anyone could react, the disguised counterweight plunged. It fell straight down the guide track and struck Simon on the top of his head with enough force to collapse him instantly to the stage. His script scattered across the boards as he dropped. One castmate shouted in panic while others froze in silence. A thin cloud of plaster dust drifted from the rafters, stirred loose by the jolt of the falling block. Stagehands who had been adjusting lights rushed forward but stopped short at the sight. The block rolled once before settling, its canvas cover torn to reveal gray concrete beneath. The rehearsal ended in chaos. Someone called for emergency services, while others gathered in small, stunned groups near the footlights. The theater went silent, except for the hum of the old lamps overhead. Investigators later examined the rigging. The weights were cataloged, and only one was abnormal. Tests confirmed the block weighed nearly double the normal counterweight. Security checks revealed Edward's access card had been used at the side door the night before, long after official crew hours. When officers searched his flat, they found stitching tools, leftover canvas, and traces of powdered cement on his workbench. He was arrested within days. The case was ruled a deliberate act of sabotage carried out with knowledge only an insider would possess. It was August 21st, 2017, in Santa Monica, California, and the boardwalk was quiet after midnight. Inside the amusement park, the rides were dark except for scattered service lights. The only machine running was the Thunder Drop roller coaster, a steel track that wound through tunnels and sharp curves. Maintenance crews often sent cars through test runs before opening or after repairs. Running this section was Marcus Allen, a 35-year-old senior ride operator. Marcus had worked the coaster for years and was trusted to oversee safety checks. He also had a reputation among staff for being harsh with junior workers. Several trainees had filed complaints about his bullying, but supervisors rarely acted on them. One of those complaints came from Leah Ramos, a seasonal employee who eventually quit. Her concerns went unanswered, but her brother Ethan worked nearby and had access to maintenance diagrams of the coaster. He studied the track, noting where a blind tunnel passed close to a service platform. That section, hidden from the main midway, became central to his plan. On a night when inspections were scheduled, Ethan entered the service area with a length of steel cable. He stretched it across the tunnel opening at neck height, fastening it tightly to anchor points on either side. The dim bulbs inside the tunnel gave little reflection, and from the front seat of a speeding car, the cable would be almost invisible. Once set, he left through a staff exit. The cable remained taut, waiting. Later that night, Marcus prepared for a routine single-car test run. A janitor working nearby saw him unlock the gate, step into the loading bay, and settle into the front seat. With no passengers and no fanfare, the restraints clicked shut. The car rolled forward, gathering speed as it climbed the first hill. The sound of wheels rattled up the incline and disappeared into the structure. Moments later, the janitor paused his sweeping. The usual echoes of the ride, the roar of descent, and the screech of turns were cut short. Instead, there was a sudden silence, broken only by the ocean wind. Minutes passed until the car coasted slowly back into the station. Marcus sat slumped in the seat. His upper body leaned forward, unmoving. Across his neck was a severe laceration, the cut running straight across. The janitor, stunned, later told investigators he noticed a brief glint inside the tunnel before hearing a sharp snap. The cable had broken loose after the strike, one end dangling from the platform rail. The test run was halted immediately. Park security sealed the coaster and kept workers back. Maintenance crews examined the tunnel and found the remnants of the steel line still bolted at one end, the other frayed from force. Investigators traced the tampering to tool marks, matching wrenches found in Ethan Ramos's garage. Records showed he had obtained the blueprints months earlier through a contractor friend. He was arrested within a week. The case was ruled a calculated act of revenge carried out with precision inside the hidden structure of the ride. The Thunder Drop stayed locked behind steel gates. For weeks, locals walked past the coaster in silence, knowing the ride that once brought excitement had become the stage for a killing disguised as a test. It was May 23, 2015, when 34-year-old Calvin Rhodes decided to test his new hammock setup at a remote pine forest campground in northern Minnesota. Calvin worked as a project coordinator for a mid-sized engineering firm and had a reputation for being methodical yet sometimes impatient with outdoor gear. His camping companions, Marcus Lee and Tasha Nguyen, had arrived earlier that afternoon. Marcus, a 33-year-old auto technician known for his practical approach, immediately noticed the campsite's concerning features. Dead pine trees surrounded their spot, victims of a recent bark beetle infestation. The standing snags displayed obvious decay, hollowed bases, bracket fungi, and peeling bark. Tasha, a 31-year-old office coordinator who always packed safety equipment, had brought a weather radio crackling with wind warnings. Her meticulous nature led her to point out debris scattered around dead tree bases, clear evidence of recent limb failures. Despite these warning signs, Calvin was eager to try his hammock between a live pine and a large dead snag. The deceased tree showed significant decay at its base, with visible rot and a hollow cavity extending several feet up the trunk. Marcus suggested relocating to healthier trees, but Calvin was already threading his suspension system through the anchor points. As afternoon progressed, wind gusts picked up strength. The forest filled with ominous sounds of creaking wood and falling twigs. The compromised snag swayed with each gust, movement becoming more pronounced as wind intensified. Calvin had rigged a bright blue tarp over his hammock, securing it with multiple guy lines staked near exposed roots. When a particularly strong gust hit, Calvin stepped directly under the ridgeline to retention his tarp. This placed him squarely within the fall zone of the deteriorating snag. The wind continued building, and suddenly a large dead branch broke free, crashing down and collapsing one corner of the tarp shelter. The falling limb created a tangle of rope and fabric that restricted Calvin's movement options. As he tried navigating around the guy lines, the main trunk reached its breaking point. The tree sheared near its rotted base, and the upper section began its deadly descent toward the hammock area. Calvin attempted to step sideways to safety, but his right foot became entangled in a taut guy line. The massive trunk struck him across his upper torso and shoulder area, driving him down against the compacted forest floor and buried root system. The impact caused multiple rib fractures, creating a flail chest condition, along with severe internal lung injuries. His left clavicle snapped from the crushing force, and when his head struck the ground, it resulted in significant skull trauma. Marcus and Tasha immediately rushed to help, carefully removing smaller branches to access Calvin's airway. They could see he was struggling to breathe, with his chest moving abnormally. Despite their CPR attempts, the combination of internal bleeding and chest wall instability made effective resuscitation impossible. Tasha climbed to higher ground, where she managed to get intermittent cell phone signal. Emergency responders eventually reached the remote site via a narrow dirt access road, but Calvin had already succumbed to his injuries. Investigation revealed the snag had been compromised for months, with advanced rot throughout its root system. Officials immediately flagged multiple hazardous trees and temporarily closed the area. This tragic incident serves as a stark reminder that dead trees pose serious risks to campers, especially during windy conditions. It was August 14, 2017, when 29-year-old Jade Emerson decided to explore a narrow slot canyon on a high desert plateau in southern Utah. Jade worked as a freelance graphic designer with a passion for adventure photography that led her to seek dramatic landscapes in remote locations. Her camping partner, Lila Moreno, chose to stay at base camp to organize equipment. Lila, a 28-year-old part-time photographer and retail associate, was detail-oriented and optimistic. She had noticed debris lines and driftwood lodged several feet up canyon walls when they arrived. clear indicators of past flooding. The morning sky remained mostly clear locally, but weather advisories mentioned thunderstorms developing over upstream headwaters. Jade planned a solo hike through a scenic section featuring sculpted sandstone, natural chokestones, and narrow passages dropping to chest height. She wore approach shoes and carried a day pack with camera equipment, water, and a windbreaker. No rope or technical gear was brought, since the route was considered straightforward. The entry point showed frequent visitor use, with polished sandstone and recent sediment deposits along the wash bottom. Before departing, Lila reminded Jade to turn around if water levels rose or thunder became audible. They agreed on a rendezvous before dusk. As Jade progressed deeper into the narrow section, temperature dropped slightly. A cool breeze funneled through the confined space, carrying a damp, earthy odor that intensified with each step. Within minutes, thin rivulets appeared around her ankles, and flow clarity deteriorated as silt and foam swirled between her steps. Turbidity increased rapidly, and a low, growing roar approached from upstream. Trickles transformed into knee-deep surge in less than a minute. Floating debris, including branches, leaves, and grit, struck her shins, making it difficult to maintain footing on slickened sandstone. Jade attempted to climb onto a minor ledge to escape rising water, but algae-covered rock defeated her attempts to gain purchase above the main channel. Her approach shoes could not grip wet, polished stone effectively enough to lift her from the flow. The first major wave arrived, carrying a substantial log that briefly wedged at a chokestone before breaking free and striking Jade in the hip. The impact rotated her body and forced her into the main flow path where current was strongest. Hydraulic pressure pinned her torso against a narrow constriction. As she pressed against sandstone, abrasions and contusions formed along her elbows, knees, and hips from grinding contact with rough rock surfaces. A second, larger surge rose above shoulder level, and she began inhaling water as flow intermittently submerged her face. She lost the ability to maintain an effective airway while pinned by relentless hydraulic forces. Her pack strap snagged on a small protrusion, momentarily holding her at torso level. However, another powerful pulse rotated her downward, fully submerging her face and upper chest beneath the muddy torrent. The mechanism of death was drowning due to entrapment in the canyon constriction during flash flood, with contributory blunt trauma from debris impact and sustained wall contact. Back at base camp, Lila reported Jade overdue when she failed to return by the agreed time. Rangers and volunteer search teams were notified and staged downstream as floodwaters receded. As water levels dropped, searchers located camera equipment fragments and pack pieces lodged in debris piles. All footprints in the approach area had been erased by silt-laden floodwater. Jade's body was recovered downstream, where it became trapped against a boulder sieve formation. Visible injuries included extensive abrasions and bruising consistent with debris impact and prolonged canyon wall contact during the flood event. It was April 9, 2016, when 41-year-old Theo Carpenter decided to brave an unexpected cold snap during a spring camping trip at a lakeside campground in northern Wisconsin. Theo worked as a warehouse supervisor and was known for being practical and resourceful, though sometimes overly confident in handling challenging situations with improvised solutions. His camping neighbor, Naomi Price, had set up nearby with her younger brother. Naomi, a 39-year-old home health aide, was naturally conscientious and resourceful, always prepared with extra supplies. She noticed Theo struggling with his gear setup as temperatures dropped below the forecasted range. The campground had recently reopened for the season, and Theo planned this trip for early season fishing. Snow patches remained under dense conifers, and overnight temperatures were forecast to plummet into the low 20s, far colder than his lightweight sleeping system could handle. As evening approached and temperature continued dropping, Theo made a fateful decision to supplement his inadequate insulation. He positioned a small charcoal grill just inside his tent vestibule, reasoning that radiant heat from glowing coals would take the edge off the bitter cold without creating significant fire hazard. A warning placard on the campground bulletin board mentioned carbon monoxide dangers from combustion devices in enclosed spaces, but Theo hadn't read the safety information thoroughly. Wind conditions were remarkably calm, eliminating natural ventilation that might have diluted dangerous gases. Concerned about heat loss, Theo zipped all tent vents completely closed and arranged his cot in a low position. With an active combustion source and sealed ventilation, conditions were perfect for hazardous carbon monoxide buildup throughout the tent's air volume. Neighboring campers, including Naomi, noticed faint smoke odor drifting from Theo's area, but the smell wasn't strong enough to raise alarm. Theo arranged extra blankets and kept the vestibule door mostly closed to prevent cold drafts. As charcoal continued slow combustion throughout the night, it produced carbon monoxide, an odorless gas that mixes readily with air and accumulates in poorly ventilated spaces. With vents sealed, concentration of this deadly gas rose steadily, while effective oxygen availability dropped to dangerous levels. Increasing carbon monoxide levels caused Theo's carboxyhemoglobin levels to rise, severely impairing his blood's oxygen delivery to vital organs. His breathing gradually became shallow as hypoxia deepened, but he remained unconscious without attempting to reposition or open ventilation. Glowing coals continued producing carbon monoxide throughout the cold night. Calm atmospheric conditions and the closed vestibule further limited air exchange that might have diluted lethal gas concentration. By early morning, carbon monoxide had reached fatal concentrations. Theo's circulation and respiration ceased without signs of struggle or gear displacement, indicating he likely lost consciousness before realizing the danger. The next morning, Naomi approached to offer hot coffee and check on her neighbor after the brutally cold night. Receiving no response, she alerted a maintenance worker making early rounds. The worker unzipped the vestibule and immediately detected the inactive grill and Theo's unresponsive form. Emergency responders moved Theo to open air and initiated resuscitation, but findings were consistent with prolonged carbon monoxide exposure and no sustained pulse was obtained. Theo was pronounced deceased on scene. Investigators measured hazardous residual carbon monoxide levels in the tent and noted sealed vents and combustion source as primary factors. Following this incident, authorities reinforced prohibitions on heaters and grills in tents regardless of temperature. Additional warning signage with larger icons was installed at water pumps and trailheads throughout the facility. It was October 2nd, 2018, when 52-year-old Marilyn Cooper decided to capture the perfect seascape sketch from a wind-exposed coastal bluff campsite along the rugged Oregon shoreline. Marilyn worked as a technical illustrator and had developed a passion for plein air sketching that drew her to dramatic coastal locations. Her longtime friend Owen Hart had accompanied her on this trip. Owen, a 55-year-old bookstore clerk known for his steady demeanor, had been Marilyn's hiking partner for over a decade. He possessed a cautious personality that often balanced Marilyn's more adventurous tendencies when finding the perfect vantage point for her artistic work. Their campsite sat approximately 70 feet above wave-cut rock platforms extending into the Pacific Ocean. The bluff edges showed clear signs of ongoing erosion from recent storms, with visible fissures and cracks running parallel to the cliff face. A wooden barrier had been installed near the most eroded segment with caution signage. The purpose of their weekend trip was taking advantage of dramatic autumn light for Marilyn's seascape studies. She brought lightweight sketching supplies and a compact camera. Informal footpaths skirted dangerously close to the bluff edge, offering unobstructed views irresistible to artists. As afternoon progressed, wind conditions intensified significantly. Strong gusts pushed loose sand and grit over the bluff lip. Owen noted evening high tide would reduce accessible rock platforms below, making rescue operations more complicated. Despite Owen's recommendation to stay behind the established barrier, Marilyn was drawn to a grassy pad near a hairline crack in the bluff edge. This position offered an unobstructed coastline view for her planned sunset sketch. Wind continued building, and Owen noticed the hairline crack near Marilyn's position seemed to widen with each powerful gust. He suggested she move to a more stable location, but Marilyn was focused on capturing changing light conditions. As Marilyn adjusted her position for a better angle, she placed her forward foot near the hairline crack Owen had been monitoring. Constant wind erosion and wave action had undermined this section's structural integrity more than was visible. Subtle subsidence occurred beneath her foot as the lip began shearing along the existing fracture plane. The cliff edge section that appeared stable suddenly gave way, removing her primary support and creating an immediate vertical drop. Marilyn fell approximately 70 feet, initially striking a sloped cliff section that redirected her trajectory toward the boulder-studded platform. The first impact produced severe fractures to her lower limbs and pelvis, causing her to roll toward a second impact point. Her secondary contact occurred when she struck her upper torso and head against a large, protruding rock formation. The audible impact was clearly heard by Owen from the cliff top, and he immediately recognized the situation's severity. Marilyn came to rest near a tidal channel where waves were washing over the platform as tide continued rising. Injuries from the high fall included severe blunt head trauma, multiple rib fractures with probable lung laceration, and significant internal hemorrhage. Owen immediately signaled other campers and directed one to contact emergency services, providing approximate cliff height and describing challenging conditions rescue personnel would face due to rising tide. Emergency responders coordinated technical rope rescue due to cliff height and dangerous tidal conditions. Initial approach was delayed to ensure rescuer safety as waves continued washing over the platform. When medical personnel reached the platform, they assessed Marilyn and determined her injuries were consistent with fatal trauma from the high fall. Officials documented cliff edge erosion patterns and fresh fracture lines adjacent to the collapse site. The hazardous area was cordoned off with additional signage installed. It was September 19, 2015, when 37-year-old Reed Donovan decided to embark on a solo weekend photography and birdwatching expedition in a remote backcountry basin in northern Montana. Reed worked as a quality control inspector for a mid-sized manufacturing company and was known for his methodical approach to work and growing passion for wildlife photography. Earlier that day, Sarah Patel had passed through the area while conducting volunteer trail steward duties. Sarah, a 32-year-old part-time barista at a neighborhood coffee shop, was known for her patient and methodical personality. She encountered Reed setting up his campsite in a well-traveled wildlife corridor. The location Reed chose showed clear signs of recent large animal activity, including overturned logs, scattered scat, and well-worn game trails converging near a seasonal water source. The area was particularly attractive to wildlife due to abundant berry patches reaching peak ripeness. Reed positioned his cook area and tent in close proximity, problematic when food odors are involved. His cookware retained faint odors from previous trips, and he left a pot with food remnants under a nearby tree rather than properly cleaning it. Reed stored his remaining snacks in a soft-sided bag inside his tent vestibule rather than using a bear-resistant canister. During his afternoon photography session, he observed fresh tracks near a berry thicket that appeared to be from a medium-sized bear. Despite this clear indication of recent bear activity, he did not adjust his food storage practices. After darkness fell, rustling and huffing sounds began occurring near Reed's cook site. The vestibule wall flexed inward as an animal investigated the stored food bag, drawn by residual odors. A bear entered the camp zone, attracted by unsecured food items and lingering cooking scents. The animal was already in close quarters when Reed became aware of its presence through sounds and movement. Reed exited his tent and confronted the situation directly. He began shouting loudly while waving a flashlight to discourage the animal, moving laterally to position himself between the bear and the forest edge. The bear, having been rewarded by food sense and finding itself in a confined space, made a short bluff charge that escalated into direct contact when the distance closed to just a few yards. During his attempt to back away, Reed stumbled over a low fallen log and fell onto his side, losing his grip on the flashlight. The bear made forceful contact with Reed's upper body, delivering powerful swipes that caused deep lacerations to his arm and crushing injuries to his chest. Reed attempted to crawl toward denser brush cover, but the bear made additional contact before retreating toward the cook area and moving off into the surrounding forest. The combination of severe lacerations and crushing chest trauma resulted in significant internal bleeding that progressed rapidly. Reed's breathing became increasingly shallow as hemorrhagic shock developed, and he remained near the fallen log, partially concealed by low brush vegetation. The mechanism of death was hemorrhagic shock and traumatic chest injury from bear contact, with secondary airway compromise due to his body position. Early the following morning, Sarah returned during her regular patrol duties. She immediately observed disturbed soil, drag marks, and scattered camping gear, indicating a serious incident had occurred. Sarah alerted authorities, and responders followed obvious sign from the cook site to the brush where Reed was located unresponsive. His injuries were incompatible with survival. Wildlife officers documented unsecured food items, tent vestibule damage consistent with animal investigation, and tracks leading to and from the campsite. Area managers issued an advisory requiring proper food storage and implemented temporary closure of nearby campsites to reduce bear habituation risk. It was June 17, 2018, when 26-year-old Paula Jennings decided to join a group river crossing to reach a scenic midstream island for photographs. At a riverside campground in the Pacific Northwest, Paula worked as a marketing coordinator for a regional nonprofit and was known for being adventurous and spontaneous, sometimes making decisions without fully considering potential risks. The group outing had been organized by Dylan Brooks, a 27-year-old delivery driver known for his easygoing personality. Also present was Mei Chen, a 25-year-old graduate research assistant in environmental science, who possessed an attentive and risk-aware personality. Recent rainfall had significantly elevated the river's flow levels, and the water appeared turbid with visible standing waves and submerged obstacles. Most participants wore sandals that provided minimal ankle support. A ranger information board mentioned dangers of cold water shock and foot entrapment hazard. The group briefly discussed the warnings and agreed to stay together during the crossing. Mei Chen pointed out the fast-moving mid-channel current and suggested selecting a crossing route that would minimize exposure to the deepest sections. However, Paula chose a line slightly downstream of the main group's path, stepping from a stable cobble bar into the opaque, fast-moving water. The riverbed's surface was highly irregular, composed of loose stones that shifted unpredictably under body weight and water pressure. As Paula stepped off a submerged rock, her right foot became wedged between two larger stones positioned in a narrow cleft beneath the surface. The powerful current immediately pushed her forward, causing her knee to bend as she dropped into a partial kneeling position that submerged her torso intermittently. Her attempts to pull her foot upward were unsuccessful due to hydraulic pressure created by the flowing water, which forced her leg deeper into the crevice between rocks, creating an increasingly tight trap. Dylan and Mei quickly moved to her position, forming a human chain to provide stability and leverage. However, their combined efforts could not generate enough force to counter the relentless current pressure. Paula's head began dipping repeatedly below the waterline as small waves passed over her position. She started aspirating river water and coughing violently, which compromised her ability to maintain an effective airway. The group attempted to rotate Paula's body to change the angle of her trapped foot, but the strong current knocked them off balance. A rope was thrown from shore by other campers, but without a proper harness, it provided limited leverage and risked pulling Paula sideways into deeper water. Cold water temperature began impairing Paula's muscle function and coordination. Her ability to hold her breath became increasingly compromised as hypothermia set in. After several cycles of submersion, Paula's effective breathing ceased entirely. The combination of cold water, physical exhaustion, and repeated aspiration had overwhelmed her body's ability to maintain basic life functions. The mechanism of death was drowning secondary to foot entrapment, with contributory factors including hypothermia and blunt trauma to her leg. Emergency responders arrived equipped with specialized throw bags and pry tools. They established secure positions upstream and downstream from Paula's location to reduce hydraulic force. Using a systematic lever technique, rescuers separated the rocks enough to free Paula's foot. She was immediately moved to shallow water, where resuscitation protocols could be implemented. Despite following standard drowning resuscitation procedures, no sustained pulse could be obtained, and Paula was pronounced deceased at the scene. Officials documented the elevated flow conditions, lack of protective footwear, and Paula's downstream angled crossing attempt as key contributing factors. Signage was updated to include diagrams illustrating foot entrapment mechanisms. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.